Hi, everyone. My name is Jean Hartnett. I'm the founder and chief executive officer of a company I call Radical Sabbatical. Radical Sabbatical exists to help individuals and organizations turn adversity into advocacy. And I am going to be talking to all of you in a 3-part video series about turning your adversity into advocacy. And the only way I know how to do that is to begin the conversation about trauma. Trauma is a topic that I have explored and researched and experienced in my own life. And in these last 5 to 6 years, I have taken a real deep dive into the topic of trauma. And I have to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that I know trauma is one of those words that not many of us want to face or discuss. But I am here to tell you that understanding trauma and the adversity that you may have experienced in your life really opens up the possibilities to living the life you always wanted to live. I'm living proof of that. So, in this 3-part series, this first video, I'm going to be discussing with you what trauma is and really give you a very brief definition so that you can apply it to your own life if it is applicable. So, people ask me all the time, how did I get interested in this topic? And I think that's a really interesting and important topic or question to answer. And simply said, the reason why I got interested into trauma is because I had to. And what I mean by that, so let me go back a little bit and tell you that I started on the front line of care in senior living in 1989. I was a certified nursing assistant at one of the best nursing homes in Lincoln, Nebraska, called Madonna Rehabilitation Hospital. And ladies and gentlemen, my goodness, this part-time job literally turned into a life-changing event for me because there was something about caring for older adults that I really loved. The bathing, the dressing, the toileting, all of those, I guess, unsavory tasks that we do as caregivers, I just absolutely loved. And I took that love of caregiving, I suppose, in my heart, even though I wasn't working on the front line of care all of the years that I've been a professional. It is something that really formed me as a human being. So when I left the long-term care field to when I graduated, I started working in politics. So I moved to Washington, D.C., worked for my senator from Nebraska. And it was there that I started to learn about public policy and the important role that public policy plays in how we run nursing homes. So when I started on the front line of care, it was 1989, like I said. And 2 years prior to 1989, the Omnibus Reconciliation Act of 1987 was passed. That's also known as OBRA 87. There was a budget bill, and attached to that budget bill was an act called the Nursing Home Reform Act. So that literally changed overnight how nursing homes functioned. And I'll give you a perfect example of it when I was on the front line of care. So in 1989, when I started, we would use what was known as restraints on residents. So if there was a resident who was at risk for falling, we would literally tie them to their chair or to their bed. And at the time, we thought we were protecting them. And when OBRA 87 was passed and those regulations were pushed over and pushed down to the nursing home, I literally walked in on one shift and was tying residents to their bed and to their chair because they were fall risks. Overnight, then the regulation changed that, so I wasn't. So fast forward all the way from 1989 to 2017. I'm no longer a certified nursing assistant. I've got my degree, my bachelor's degree. I went on and got my master's in health services administration with a specialty in long-term care. And now I'm a chief executive officer of the largest nursing home in Nebraska. And again, Congress passed legislation that upgraded or sought to change the way that we cared for older adults. And in 2017, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, that's the government agency that pays nursing homes and also regulates them, came out with a series of new requirements that nursing homes had to follow. And they phased those requirements into 3 different phases because they knew that the changes that they were proposing were massive. And in the 3rd phase of those regulations was what was known as trauma-informed care. And ladies and gentlemen, when I read that regulation, I had no idea what the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services wanted us to do. Essentially, they were telling us that as caregivers and as people who run nursing homes, we had to understand the adversity that had occurred in the older adult's life of the people that we were caring for in order to build a care plan around them so that we would know what their triggers are to that trauma and avoid re-traumatization. And I just thought to myself, I don't know how to do that. First of all, I had no tools or no script, if you will, to how to talk to an older adult about the trauma that they may have experienced. So I was really confused by the regulation. So with that confusion, I called the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services and I said, why is it that you want us to know what has happened in this older adult's life? Why is it so important for us as caregivers to know their histories, what may have happened to them as young adults or even children, in order to have them have a really great experience in my nursing home? And the nurse consultants that I spoke to said that they made this regulation, they call it promulgating a regulation or enforcing a regulation, is that 90% of the older adults we care for have likely experienced a traumatic event in their life. And they want to make sure that we're aware of what that trauma is in order, again, like I said, to mitigate against re-traumatization. So even with that phone call, I was still confused on what it meant. And it wasn't until I left the senior living profession in 2019 because I was burnt out in caring for, and really wasn't caring for older adults, but really running organizations. I left the senior care field and went to a children's hospital and medical center. And it was there that I learned about childhood trauma. And I'm going to get into how I learned about childhood trauma through the Adverse Childhood Experience Study in session 2. But suffice it to say, once my social workers taught me what trauma is, it literally changed my life. And I went back to my office and I threw my notebook across the room, and I can still see myself doing this. And I thought to myself, why aren't we doing this in senior care? Why don't we have an ACEs like an assessment? Because that's what ACEs became, to really demonstrate or really help us have a way to talk about trauma with our older adults. So ever since that time of learning from my social workers at a pediatric hospital, I've been taking that knowledge and applying it to our field, which is geriatrics. So let me take a pause here and really talk about what trauma is. And I'm going to talk about it in a way that all of us in the long-term care profession can resonate with. And that's to talk about trauma as a wound. All of us in senior living have experienced wounds, haven't we? Because we see them on our residents' body. We try to prevent them with pressure injuries on an older adult's body. So we have a really great familiarization with what a wound is. And trauma in Greek is wound. And we know that wounds have certain characteristics. They're either red and raw and really painful to the touch. When you have a new wound, it has all of the pain sensors really close to the skin. So even the slightest touch of touching a person's wound that is red and raw and open becomes really sore. And people like freak out if you touch it, because even when you're trying to treat it with medication or with a wound dressing, it is so sensitive that people really react to it. And that's kind of like the wounds that we have from a psychological standpoint, from a traumatic standpoint. Our wounds that we have that are have inflicted our psyche can be that way, red, raw, and sore to the touch, can't they? The other characteristics of trauma is the other type of scar, or the other type characteristics of a wound is another type of scar, which some of our residents have on their bodies that they've had for a long time. And those wounds are calloused over. Depending on how deep the original wound was, it can be a really thick scar. And if you touch that scar on a resident, it doesn't hurt them. It is calloused over, it is numbed over, it is healed over. And when you touch it, they don't even know that you're touching it. And that's the other characteristic of trauma. When we become traumatized, some of us have those red raw wounds, while others of us take our injury, take our wound, take our trauma, and have it be calloused over where we don't talk about it. And the best way that I can demonstrate that is to do a little trick with some tools that I have out here. So if this lipstick here represents a wound, I'm just going to paint a little wound here on my wrist here. So let's pretend that this is your wound. And when we develop these wounds through abuse that we have abuse that has been inflicted upon us, or through neglect, or through having, let's say, a motor vehicle accident, or anything that could be considered a traumatic event. If we don't want to heal or deal right away with that traumatic event, what we do is we attempt to cover up that wound so that nobody knows that it happened to us. And we keep that wound silent. We kind of suffer in silence, if you will. And we just don't want to talk about this traumatic event or this adversity that occurred in our lives. But inevitably, what happens is, unbeknownst to people in our lives, they can brush up against that wound, meaning they can say something that triggers that memory of that original wounding event. And you just fly off the handle, and you have no idea or explanation of where these feelings came from, but you just know that you're reacting to the way that this person addressed you or talked to you, or the way that they smelled, or something triggers a memory that you thought was covered up, but your behavior is exhibiting that this wound is really close to the skin. So in order to avoid acting like that, because you know that it's not productive, what you do then is you cover up that wound with a Band-Aid. You say, my wound got a little bit bigger there. You cover up this wound because you don't want to act in a way that is antisocial. You cover it up with a Band-Aid. And that Band-Aid can be anything, like drugs and alcohol. It can be food. It can be social media. It can be anything that you choose that really masks that wound. And these are called coping mechanisms. So workaholism, alcoholism, for me, quite frankly, my drug of choice was food. So I was constantly numbing myself the way, to avoid looking at the wound that I had. I would constantly numb myself with food. And so this works for a while. These coping mechanisms do work. I will never knock a person who uses drug and alcohol as a way to cope and soothe. I will never criticize someone who uses food or social media to cope and soothe. But eventually, these coping mechanisms don't work any longer. And we find that our adaptive behaviors, the way that we adapted with these coping mechanisms, are now maladaptive. And so what we need to do, and we know this in senior living, all wounds, you've got to let the air to it. You've got to take off the Band-Aid and have a look at what happened to you in a real serious way. And a lot of times this happens towards middle life, where our brains and our bodies, that I'm going to talk about in session 3, really want to align with one another. The coping mechanisms just aren't working any longer. And it's time to take a look at what happened to us, again, in a real serious and concerted fashion. So that kind of gives us an introduction to what trauma is. And it gives you kind of a description in terms of that illustration that I just did. The definition of trauma, according to the American Psychological Association, is a serious event that has had lasting impacts on us. And so I don't want to mischaracterize things as trauma when they're not. And trauma is a very subjective topic. So what may be traumatic to me may not be traumatic to you. But just keep that definition of trauma being a horrific or serious event that has lasting effects on us as kind of our guiding principles as we talk about trauma. If you want to learn more about this topic, and if you want to learn more about Radical Sabbatical, my company, you can go to www.radicalsabbaticalcare.com and learn more about my company. On my website is an ebook that I developed called The Road to Resiliency, because I know, ladies and gentlemen, that once you learn more about trauma, once it kind of awakens inside of you, you're going to want to learn what I've learned around not only the topic of trauma, but how to heal from it, how to become a different person in your life, how to show up differently, how to no longer, run away from your troubles and try to numb and avoid the life that you live, and really fully embrace the life that you have. So you can go to radicalsabbaticalcare.com, and on my website is an ebook that is beautifully outlined into 5 sections that can walk you through a path to resiliency. So I look forward to discussing more with you about trauma, and I appreciate you taking the time to be with me today, and I'll see you in my next session.